Alright, so we need to wrap up our lecture for today on the skeletal system, going along with the rest of our chapter 39 on muscles and skeleton. As we've seen before, back when we first started covering the animal chapters, the skeleton is made up of several types of tissues. We have obviously the bone itself as a connective tissue. We have nervous tissue, nerves running through the bones. We have circulatory tissue and so forth. We also have ligaments, which is another type of dense, regular connective tissue, much like tendons in this case. Ligaments, though, are connecting bone to bone, whereas tendons are going to connect muscle to bone. Cartilage is going to be involved as well, especially early on in development. We see this picture over here, which is sort of a really young fetus, starting off initially with a cartilaginous endoskeleton, eventually that cartilaginous skeleton being replaced by bone, solidifying and become more of what we know as a calcium phosphate-based skeleton that you have as an adult. It also provides smooth movement between joints. When you have bones that come together, you have joints. Very often you'll have cartilage in between those joints to provide a sort of lubrication or smooth movement between bones so you don't get bone on bone grinding together. Bone also kind of cushioning between vertebrae, as well as obviously the tips of the nose and the ears and so forth as well. And then of course the bone itself, which is what the most of this rest of this lecture is going to talk about here as we finish up. Chondrocytes are cells which give rise to cartilage. We talked about these again back in our first chapter, I think chapter 31 on animal tissues. Chondrocytes are cartilage cells. They are, as with any other type of connective tissue, embedded within a type of matrix which they themselves are going to produce. Chondroitin is the matrix in this case. Cartilage cells are alive within that. Cartilage is rather flexible. It's relatively strong. It has a fairly high tensile strength. But it does have some disadvantages as compared to bone. For example, cartilage, because it doesn't have the same degree of blood supply and nutrient flow and oxygen flow, doesn't repair itself like bone does. If you have a cartilage tear, that tends to stick with you for a very, very long time. In fact, in some cases permanently, because cartilage does not repair itself. So this heals relatively slowly. And again, over here on this picture, very similar to what we saw back in chapter 31, chondrocytes trapped within these spaces embedded within the cartilaginous matrix of both collagen and chondroitin. Those cells are sort of trapped inside those spaces and live more or less permanently inside of there. Bone is what's going to replace cartilage later on in development. The embryo gradually will have calcium phosphate coming in, providing more strength and more rigidity to the bone itself. In this case, we're going to be talking about osteocytes, which initially start with osteoblasts. Osteoblasts give rise to osteocytes and also osteoclasts, which we'll see in a second. So this gradual replacement that takes place is one that eventually leads to us having hard bony tissue, whereas at one point in time we all started off with a cartilaginous-based endoskeleton, much like some of our ancestors. The earliest of the fishes, as we'll see as we get to our chapter on vertebrates, the earliest fishes start off with a cartilaginous-based skeleton, things like hagfish and lampreys, as well as some of the chondrichthyes, sharks and skates and rays. All have cartilaginous-based skeletons, and so early on in our development, we kind of reflect our ancestors in the fact that we maintain the cartilaginous skeleton at least for a little while during our development. We've seen this before in lab. Compact bone is the more dense, harder outer covering of places like the epiphyses of the bones, the ends of the bones, as well as the shaft of the bone. Very often will have a layer of compact bone around it to protect the spongy bone within. Osteons are rings of osteocytes that surround a capillary in particular and provide functionality for those bones cells. It gives them the ability to remain alive and function and repair if needed. Very, very dynamic is bone. Spongy bone is much less dense. It's typically within, again, the compact bones within that or inside of that. This also where in some bones you would tend to find bone marrow. So red blood cells and white cells and so forth can be produced in the bone marrow within the spongy bone of some types of bones. Again, lots and lots of blood supply, lots of nutrients and oxygen flow and CO2 and waste disposal capacity gives this type of bone a lot more of a dynamic feel than does cartilage, for example. So this picture we've seen before. We have a typical long bone over here with epiphyses on the ends, the wide parts of the bones, the shaft of the bone with a very thin layer of compact bone, some degree of spongy bone within that, and then we have a medullary cavity inside of there, which is where you're going to find a lot more of the blood vessels and a lot more active kinds of processes happening inside the bone. Up here in the epiphysis up top, we have spongy bone. You can also see the growth plate happening up there as well. We'll talk about growth here in a little bit, how that actually occurs and when it stops. But that's how long bones get longer is the expanding of those cartilaginous-based growth plates and the gradual replacement that they see with bone, which eventually results in bone lengthening, stopping at some point in time. So as we see in this picture over here, lots of blood supply. We have those osteocytes inside of um, the the Haversian canals. We see these concentric rings like we talked about on the last slide. We have lots and lots of communication and connection and functionality within the bone. Osteoblasts, again, are the bone-forming cells. They are kind of like a precursor to bone cells. They have the ability to turn into one of at least a couple of different types of bone cells. Osteoblasts can turn into osteoclasts. They can also turn into osteocytes. So these cells, once they're formed, are going to begin to secrete around themselves a layer of both collagen, which is going to form the periosteal layer, the outer part of the bone, as well as calcium carbonate, which is the main matrix of the bone, which gives it the high degree of strength that it's going to have. Osteocytes are the cells that are typically alive at maturity in living bone in most vertebrates, with the exception, again, of the fishes. Fishes don't have living cells in their bone at maturity, but every other vertebrate group does: amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Lots of blood flow, lots of innervation here, lots of nerves going in there as well. So very dynamic tissue. Osteoclasts are these cells that break down bone at times. So there are times when perhaps you need to break down bone in response to, for example, parathyroid hormone. One of the things that parathyroid hormone does is it allows these osteoclasts to increase in activity. It also tends to cause osteocytes to decrease in activity, and both of those things are going to cause a progressive breakdown of bone, a release of calcium into the bloodstream, and the further availability of calcium throughout the rest of the body. So osteoclasts and osteocytes have opposite effects. One builds bone, one breaks bone down, and they do so in response to different types of conditions and different needs of the body at different points in time. This is something we mentioned in class today. Bone is again very dynamic. It can be remodeled in response to stress. We can have thickening of bone, for example. So this little picture down here shows you a case where you have a bone, medullary cavity, compact bone on the outside. We have a force pushing down, which essentially is gravity in the case of this picture. And we have a reaction force, which is the force of the bone holding your body upright against the force of gravity. And so if these forces are significant, what you can actually end up with is a flexing of the bone in response to both gravity and the strength of the bone itself. So the bone begins to curve a little bit, and you get this nice curvature, which, as you can imagine, if it's significant enough, could actually result in the bone fracturing. This bending is not a very sustainable kind of a thing, and if it bends enough, breaking becomes more likely. So the result of this and what bone can do is that it can get thicker, right? So we have over here a relatively thin layer of compact bone, but as the stress is done over and over and over in sort of a chronic kind of a way, the bone begins to deposit thicker and thicker layers of compact bone, which causes less flexing and more of an upright, reinforced sort of structure here in response to those same stresses. So that gives us a degree of resistance and resilience if we were exposed to the same kind of a stress over and over. Today in class, we talked about this. One of the types of treatments for osteoporosis in some patients is actually weightlifting, because it encourages redepositing of calcium phosphate into bones, causing them to get thicker and stronger and be more able to resist forces that they might be subject to. All right, so our last little section here is on movement. We're going to start off with a really quick discussion on the different types of joints or places where bones come together. And there are four basic types. We have ball and socket joints, where you essentially get movement in 360 degrees, all directions more or less. So your shoulder and your hips are nice examples of a ball and socket type joint. These have a lot more flexibility and a lot more range of movement, but they also tend to be somewhat weaker. And because in fact they are so movable, they are in some cases more prone to being damaged. Dislocations and so forth can happen as a result. Hinge joints are much more heavily reinforced, to the point where they only move in one direction, so they move back and forth, but that's it. They do not move in all 360 degrees. So hinge joints would be your elbow and your knees, among other, are hinge joints. Stabilization there with tendons, for example, and ligaments to give you more stability of that particular joint, and perhaps less possibility of dislocation, although certainly tearing those ligaments and tendons can be very traumatic as well. Gliding joints are where bones move back and forth past each other. The best examples of gliding joints are the bones, your vertebrae, the bones in your backbone. They sort of glide back and forth past each other. And the final type is a combination joint, which is a joint that has at least two of the other types of joints together in the same spot. So the lower jaw, for example, is a very nice example of a combination joint that incorporates both gliding as well as hinge joints together to allow you to move your lower jaw in all different kinds of directions, back and forth, side to side. Um, it is definitely a combination type joint. So just a couple of images here of different types of joints, showing you ball and socket here in the hip, allowing you more 360-degree movement. There's our tail again today, as we talked about in class. Our hinge joint here in the knee, so there's the patella or the kneecap, the femur, the tibia, and the fibula. This is a hinge joint, so it moves the leg back and forth, but certainly not so much side to side. Typically, if you have a lateral force on that joint, it's not going to end real well if that force is very significant at all. Gliding joints are in the vertebrae, so the vertebrae can move back and forth past each other and allow your spine to be somewhat flexible. Combination joints have, like I said before, a couple of different types of joints incorporated into the same spot. Sort of a depiction here of a hinge joint from your book, showing you how a hinge operates. Hopefully you know how that works, but also how, in this case, your elbow works. So your humerus, your radius, your ulna, and this particular hinge joint, which can go back and forth and open and close just like a hinge can, but doesn't really do a whole lot of side-to-side or lateral types of movement. And so now we've got the joint itself, the humerus up here, the radius, the ulna, as well as several different tendons, the biceps. Actually, I'm sorry. No, this is the leg. The femur up here, the quadriceps group, fibula, tibia down here, the gastrocnemius muscle down here at the top part of the calf, and then we also have the hamstrings up there in the back. It took me a second to orient myself there to that picture, but that's what we're dealing with there. The hamstrings, quadriceps, gastrocnemius or calf muscle, as well as some of the ligaments that are involved with holding the kneecap together, stabilizing it. The cartilage is in there as well. If you ever have a cartilage, or as you get older, as that cartilage begins to kind of wear away, those bones begin to contact each other to some degree, and that can be extremely uncomfortable and painful to some degree once you get to the point where that cartilage is mostly gone. Again, it's a ball and socket type joint, so in this case the hip fitting together with the femur down here at the bottom, allowing you directional movement in many, many directions. So different animals can move in different ways. We have both appendicular and axial locomotion. Appendicular locomotion is moving using the appendages. Axial locomotion is using the rest of the body to move. So it's using the main axis of the body, if you want to think of it that way, of movement for axial type locomotion. One of the things we're going to see here kind of quickly in this chapter is challenges faced by aquatic versus terrestrial organisms. One of the things that we see living on land is that one thing that shows up on land that we don't have to deal with in water is gravity, right? So in water is a very buoyant, very supportive type of medium. You don't need to have a lot of strength to be able to stand up against the force of gravity if you live in water. If you're on land, on the other hand, you have to have a lot more strength to deal with the forces of gravity, and so that's a much more significant challenge. If you live in water, the challenge that you face primarily is the high amount of drag that's provided on your body against movement, or resistance to movement that you have living in water. Living on land, air provides relatively little resistance, but living in the water provides a lot more resistance. So different animals have different challenges depending on where they live, and have found different ways of solving those challenges. Like we said before, you live in water, locomotion, buoyancy is not really an issue. Standing up against the force of gravity is not really an issue, but moving forward against all the drag of the water, the very thick viscous medium of the water, becomes more of a challenge. Some invertebrates, things like squid and octopi, can move through the water using what's called hydraulic propulsion. As we'll see here probably next week, things like octopi and squid can even use a type of jet propulsion where they take water into what's called their mantle cavity. They expel it very, very forcefully, and that causes the propulsion through the water at a very, very rapid rate. And squids and octopi can move extremely fast if they want to, using that jet propulsion type technique. Other types of invertebrates typically swim. Octopi and squid are one of the few that don't do that. And of course, living vertebrates in the water are going to use either the main axis of their body, in the case of an eel on the left, or using primarily just their tail, as the trout does there on the right. So the two differences here are relating to what part of the body is involved with all of these vector arrows here that we see kind of in the middle of this eel. What we're trying to get for this eel is thrust. We want to make this eel go from the bottom part of the slide up to the top part of the slide, and that's the direction this animal is trying to move, is the red line. To get there, we have a couple of things that we have to do. We have a lateral force, so we're going to push the body, in this case left to right. That's going to generate a push force in the other direction, equal opposite force in the other direction. We also have our lateral force here pushing more or less sideways. So in the end here, what this amounts to is the ability of these arrows to kind of all even out and result in a bottom to top sort of movement for the eel on that picture. For the trout, it's the same kind of concept, only now we're just going to be using the tail. Rather than using the main axis of the body, we just rely on the tail, and that allows the animal to be pushed forward through the water. The sum total of these arrows is more or less a net forward directional movement for the animal there on the right. In the water, the body, the tail fin, those work pretty well. On land, obviously, that's not going to be usually too efficient for most animals on land, with the exception of snakes and also a group of amphibians that are kind of similar to snakes. There's a group of lizards which again superficially resemble snakes in that they don't have legs. But otherwise, on land, we're going to be using legs. So land-dwelling vertebrates are typically called tetrapods. Tetrapod means four legs, four-legged animals. Birds can use their appendages sort of somewhat differently. They're typically using their forelimbs, obviously, for flight, although not always. Birds that swim can use their hind legs for or as rudders. So they swim or they propel themselves forward with their front legs, and they may steer with their hind legs. So if you see something like a penguin in the water, penguins are essentially going to flap their wings underwater just like a bird in the air flaps its wings. They're more or less swimming underwater and using their hind legs to steer themselves like rudders in the water. Other animals use their hind legs for propulsion. Some birds will use their hind legs for propulsion, and they'll steer using the body, in other words. So they're somewhat different as far as what appendages are used for what, but they still kind of accomplish the same task and do so very efficiently. If you've ever seen video or pictures of penguins swimming, or if you've ever been to a zoo where part of the tank is enclosed with like plexiglass, you can actually see the animals below the surface of the water. They swim extremely efficiently. It's underwater in their respective habitats. On land, we have to deal with gravity. Terrestrial mollusks, which are one of the few examples of animals on land that don't use their appendages, use a layer of slime and a mantle that they are going to have a lot of musculature to. That's going to allow them to move on land. Most everything else are going to have legs that keep their bodies up off the ground and legs that allow them to move through their environment. Jointed appendages, especially in the arthropod group. Arthropod literally means jointed foot. In a literal sense, that's not true. Actually, what the name is referring to is the fact that the legs are jointed, but in any case, they're extremely, extremely efficient, very stable, and very able to move across uneven terrain. Vertebrates or tetrapods. Arthropods can be anything from hexapods. In the case of the insects, they can be things that have 8 legs, as in the case of the arachnids. Things like the decapods are crustaceans typically, so they have at least 10 legs, or typically have 10 legs. Sometimes they have more in some cases as well. Millipedes and centipedes are also arthropods. They have a lot more legs, although maybe not necessarily 1,000 or even 100 legs. They do have a bunch, so they're definitely having a lot of these jointed appendages they use to move themselves through their environment. The trade-off is that the more legs you have, the more complex movement needs to be, the more difficulty you might have coordinating the action of all those legs. I know a lot of people that get sort of tripped up walking around on 2 legs, much less trying to walk on 30 or 40 or 50 like a centipede or a millipede might do. So even though you can move maybe more quickly or over more uneven terrain, coordinating all those legs together can be a bit of a challenge. On land, terrestrial tetrapods, if you think about how something like your dog or your cat would walk, when they walk, typically the feet that are on the ground are those that are diagonally opposite from each other. So as your dog is walking across your living room, its front left leg and its hind right leg are on the ground at the same time, and they're sort of moving in sequence. So the next step, the right front leg is going to be on the ground, and the hind back left leg is going to be on the ground at the same time. And so that what that does is generate more stability. If you're a hexapod, if you're an insect, what you can do is to place 2 legs on one side of the body on the ground at one time, and the other alternative leg on the other side of the body on the ground at the same time. So basically, think about like a tripod. Right? Any given step, any given point in time, the body essentially is sitting on a tripod, which is a very, very stable and hard to overturn kind of a structure. So it's all about stability when you're on land. Things like kangaroos, rabbits, frogs, obviously they're more of a saltatorial locomotion where they're jumping or hopping or somehow moving through the environment that way. Some animals, very, very adept. They can go long distances by sort of jumping or hopping from place to place. Living in the air primarily, are 4 different groups of animals, and they all have arrived at this final ecological niche independently. They are insects, which have probably the most different of all wings. Pterosaurs, which are very, very old and very, very dead flying dinosaurs, flying reptiles. Birds, which are descendants of reptiles. And bats, which of course are mammals. So they all do the same thing. They all fly in one way or another. Insects, very, very different. The circulatory system, the musculature, everything is extremely different from the other 3 groups. Pterosaurs are probably the next most different group. So in a pterosaur, the wing is actually a membrane of skin stretched out over the ring finger of each forelimb or each hand, right? So if you look at a picture of a pterodon, what you'll notice is that most of the area of the wing actually is the skin stretched over the 4th finger, the ring finger. The other 4 fingers are very, very tiny, very much reduced, and almost don't show up at all. But that, except for that one ridiculously long ring finger, which is, maybe 100 times longer than any of the other fingers or front phalanges in the case of the pterosaurs. In birds, it's the entire arm that's making up the wing. So the humerus, the radius, the ulna, all the muscles involved, and the skin and feathers involved, that's what makes up the wing if you're a bird. It's the entire structure. If you're a mammal, it's the entire hand. So it's kind of a happy medium between pterosaurs and birds. They're using their 5 fingers with a membrane stretched over those, and the rest of the arm or the forelimb doesn't come into play as much as it would in, say, a bird. So convergent evolution, they all fly. They've all kind of figured out evolutionarily different ways of doing it, but they're all of them, including the one that's extinct, at least at one time, are very, very successful groups. So flight is definitely one thing which gives you some ability to colonize faraway places and take advantage of a resource which may otherwise fall unused by some other groups. This picture here again shows you the actual pictures of the different forelimbs, also showing you where these traits arise. Insects aren't even on this graph because they are so distant related to all these other groups of vertebrates. We've got bats with most of the wing consisting of the hand itself. Pterosaurs, this long, long structure here is the ring finger. The other 4 fingers are up here. This is the thumb, and the other 3 fingers up here as part of the hand. Most of the wing is the ring finger. And in a hawk, it's the entire arm that makes up the airfoil or the flying structure of those particular reptilian descendants. So that's going to kind of wrap us up for today. Hopefully that's going to go okay for you guys. Hopefully my mistake there on that one picture with the bones and muscles of the leg isn't going to be too confusing. I hope I corrected that okay. But if you have any questions, just let me know and I'll do what I can to try to help. Otherwise, we will see you in class next time.